welcome back to the show. I'm Daisy Cousens. Well, in an ever-changing global climate, one thing remains constant: the threat of China, more specifically, the Chinese Communist Party. And with the Chinese premier currently in Australia, the issue is more present than ever, especially with journalist Cheng Li blocked from the cameras by Chinese officials at an event with the premier. And we are very fortunate tonight to have with us an expert on the threat the Chinese Communist Party poses, Liberal Party Defence and National Security Policy Chair Lincoln Parker, to analyse the issue for us. Lincoln, welcome to the show. Fabulous to have you here. How have you been since we last spoke?
Thanks so much for having me, Daisy. I've been great, and yeah, there's a lot to talk about, particularly with regard to Premier Lee's recent visit to Australia. So yeah, looking forward to it.
No, I'm so pleased to have your take on this. And look, speaking of the Chinese Premier Lee, as we know, he's come to visit this week. Look, what's the lowdown? What have we heard of this visit? What's going on?
Yeah, so Premier Lee came earlier this week and he first flew into Adelaide, and I think ostensibly to check on Chinese investments. As you know, the Chinese Communist Party and affiliated groups own the Port of Darwin, they own half the Port of Newcastle, they own a bunch of Australian agricultural farmland, vineyards, and they're trying to invest into more Australian mineral resources as they possibly can. And so I think he came down here to throw a bit of a fig leaf to a very, a Prime Minister, Albanese, and the Labor Party that are doing everything that they can possibly do to please the Chinese Communist Party, so a fig leaf in that respect, and show goodwill to the Labor Party for, I guess, bending the knee.
Yes, and they really do seem to bend the knee, don't they? I mean, Scott Morrison had his flaws, shall we say, but he was always very, very, very strong on China, and he had to be credited for that. And meanwhile, when it comes to Anthony Albanese, I mean, he's come under fire again for not having enough of a backbone when it comes to China. And this time it was because he didn't come down like a hammer on the behaviour of Chinese officials after the Cheng Li incident when she was blocked from the cameras. He just called the operation clumsy and ham-fisted, which is just such soft language for something that really was quite serious. What's it going to take for Albo to actually stand up for us?
Well, he hasn't stood up for us over the last 3 years that he's been Prime Minister, and I think your audience will remember the fact that the Australian Defence Force have been attacked on a number of occasions, and the Prime Minister hasn't stood up for our own troops on any of those occasions. We're all well aware that the Australian Navy had 2 divers in Japan's economic exclusion zone when we had the propeller that was fouled. And so we had to have 2 divers in their Navy to try and unfoul the propeller. And then the Chinese naval destroyer, instead of coming to assist and help a stranded Australian ship, they actually started using very strong pulses of sonar that can kill a human being. And actually those 2 Australian divers were hospitalised due to that attack. And then it was just a couple of days later that we saw Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in San Francisco, you know, hugging Chinese President Xi Jinping instead of saying, listen, mate, don't attack our soldiers, sailors or airmen. And we've also seen attacks on our pilots, we've seen attacks on our ships, we've seen numerous attacks and intimidation from the Chinese military onto the Australian Defence Force, and not once has our Prime Minister stood up for them.
But why, my question amongst other things is, why is the Chinese military attacking our troops like this? I mean, what incentive do they have to do that?
Well, they're just bullies. And so the Chinese military has been expanding rapidly over the last 30 years to become a global military. So their military is by far the largest military. In fact, their navy is now larger than the United States. They have a larger missile and rocket force than the United States does with longer range missiles. They have the largest army in the world. It was just recently announced that all Chinese children will now be subjected to education from an elementary level, so they'll be receiving military education, and then all Chinese students that are in high school will be forced into a draft, kind of like a Hitler Youth. And so we haven't seen a Hitler Youth established since the 1930s, and we all know how that turned out, and China is doing the exact same thing. So China is on the warpath. They want to they essentially want to kick the United States out of our hemisphere, which includes trying to get the United States out of Australia, out of Taiwan, out of the region. And they're being very aggressive in order to do that. And Australia is sort of the anchor of our hemisphere, and they would love to have a very friendly government in Australia, which they've got now with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and the Labor government, in order to try and kick the United States out as best they can.
Yeah, it really is. It's extraordinary and it's terrifying that China is on the warpath like that. So, look, what is their ultimate goal? If Xi Jinping could have, #1 on his wish list ticked off, what would that be?
Well, at the moment, his #1 goal is to take Taiwan. Now, for your audience, Taiwan has never been a part of the People's Republic of China, and the Chinese Communist Party go around saying that we want to reunify. Well, in order to reunify, you need to have been unified at some point in the past, and that has never been the case. And so Taiwan makes Chinese Communist Party look very bad, because you've got a nation that's essentially the same size as Australia, that's a democracy, freedom-loving, and they're very, very prosperous, far more prosperous GDP per person in Taiwan than you have in China. So they make China look bad. They do not want to be under the yoke of the Chinese communists. They saw what happened in Tibet, they saw what happened in Hong Kong, and they do not want to be crushed like that. They want to have their freedom. So, of course, the Chinese Communist Party, and they've said this very plainly, a number of times, that we're going to take Taiwan come what may. So that's his first thing. And what that will achieve, if he is successful in doing that, is essentially kicking the United States out of that part of the world. And then they will no longer be the top dog. And so you will suddenly have all of the countries in that region, from Malaysia to Indonesia to Vietnam and even Japan, have to bow down to the new emperor, because Uncle Sam will no longer have, the top billing.
And it is such a worry, particularly with such a weak president like Joe Biden in power. I mean, God, for so many reasons, I hope Donald Trump gets voted back in November. And one of them is because he actually does stand up to these dictators I mean, we all remember Little Rocket Man with with Keqiang,
yes,
which was actually, people derided Trump for that, but was actually a very effective way of calling his bluff, and I remember him backing down. So yeah, we need Trump back in power for that reason.
Yeah.
Now look, on the subject of Labor being so friendly to China, another question I have to ask is why? I mean, China doesn't align with Australia's values at all. They're openly hostile, as you said, in terms of their military. They've been suspected of many cyber attacks against Australia.
Every day.
So exactly. So why does Albo sort of kowtow to China like this?
Well, it's an interesting question, Daisy, and I've often asked this of myself, and I think what you need to do is look back in history for the answer. And the answer comes in the form of Gough Whitlam. So Gough Whitlam and Anthony Albanese and a strong part of the left wing of the Labor Party are big fans of Gough Whitlam. And in today's Labor Party, you've got the likes of, Albo, you've got Penny Wong, and you have Bob Carr, of course, and Paul Keating, who are all very pro-Chinese Communist Party, and indeed work with the Chinese Communist Party in the case of Paul Keating. And indeed even elements of the Chinese Communist Party with the likes of Bob Carr. So you have a very strong faction within the Labor Party that are anti-United States and pro-China, and it goes all the way back to Gough Whitlam, who was the first Australian Prime Minister at the time to go over and open up Australian diplomatic ties with China and force, was essentially Taiwan was kicked to the curb. And we're seeing a re-emergence of that. I mean, maybe it's been slumbering in the Labor Party for some time. Certainly Bob Hawke wasn't of that same ilk, but now you have a Labor Party, particularly a very strong left wing of the Labor Party, that are very pro-Chinese Communist Party.
And it's incredibly alarming. I mean, I think from what I know, at least part of that I'd imagine is just an anti-America sentiment. I mean, it's just sort of trendy on the left to be anti the US because, you know, anti-capitalist, all that kind of stuff. But I wonder if you can answer this for me. Part of me has always suspected that maybe the reason certain factions of the Labour Party are so sort of apathetic about the way China runs its country, you know, very authoritarian, lots of, you know, citizen control and surveillance. I hate to say it, do you think there's that faction of the Labour Party that actually kind of gets that philosophy and maybe just doesn't have that much of a problem with it secretly?
Yeah, I think so. So if you look at how the Australian Labor Party is run, it is dominated by the very large unions. Now, most Australians aren't aware that there are very few Australian workers that are members of unions anymore. But how come the union movement is so very, very powerful when less than 10% of the entire Australian workforce is unionised? And I have nothing actually against the concept of a union, but the way that the unions run in Australia it's really not in Australia's best interest. They're very powerful. They get a lot of money from their union super funds, which just pours money into the union movement. And unions are all about doing everything they can for the unions and controlling the Labor Party. And we're all well aware that almost every single Labor member of Parliament has been or is still in the union movement. Now, the unions are for themselves. They're not for Australia. They're not for the benefit of society. And so, you know, that's where the Labor Party are really getting their ideology from. And the unions are about control. And so Chinese Communist Party is an attractive model. They are about control and all about themselves. And so, therefore, that's what we're seeing in Australia, and it's a shame because it's not for the benefit of all Australians or indeed all working class people.
Absolutely, and I'll say it once, I've said it again, it is terrifying not only that China is posing this threat, but that we have people actively in the Labor Party who, at least in my opinion, don't seem to be too worried about it because, like I said, they kind of get and largely condone the philosophy of running a country. Lincoln Parker, as always, I'm so glad we could get you back to talk on this. It's fantastic to have you, and I really look forward to talking to you again sometime soon.
Thanks for having me, Daisy.